Get ready for some haunted handheld horror today as we delve into the library of the original Nintendo Game Boy. While that platform has seen an incredible resurgence of homebrewed horror games in recent years, at the time of the console's initial run, it wasn't exactly known for actually scary or immersive horror experiences. But after scouring through over 1,000 titles for this monochromatic monster of a system, I've found it still has a nice chunk of action and adventure games with spooky themes and settings. Some great, and some ghastly. So let's take a look. We'll start strong today with a personal favorite of mine on the Game Boy, Gargoyle's Quest, developed and published by Capcom and first released in 1990, and starring one of the most notorious enemies from Ghosts and Goblins, the Red Armor, aka Firebrand. Since this was a handheld spin-off from that popular arcade title, Capcom was able to spread their wings a bit and experiment not only with a much different moveset for our winged beast here, but also expand the gameplay scope beyond pure platforming. One half of the game has a top-down exploration kind of view, similar to traditional RPGs like Dragon Quest, where you traverse across the ghoul realm, gathering up enough power to take on Brieger, king of the destroyers hell-bent on taking over the place. There are even little towns where you can talk to various monster villagers and rest up, and while on the overworld, you will have to engage in random encounters at times. And it's here where the other aspect of gameplay comes in, with some great action platforming sections. Firebrand can shoot fireballs to attack his foes, and jump and hover for a limited time to navigate through the stages, along with being able to cling to walls. And as the game progresses, your abilities will improve, like having higher jumps, longer hover times, stronger attacks, or other projectiles to access new areas, like being able to break certain blocks, or to create your own climbing spots on spikes. Overall, it's a really cool variety of movement, and it pairs well with some great but challenging level design. Previously mentioned random encounters are usually just quick fights with a few monsters, but there are plenty of fully fleshed out stages and boss fights as well. And while it certainly gets tough at times, it's not as brutal as Ghosts and Goblins, and is a bit more accessible and less grueling of an adventure, and an absolutely recommended Game Boy title from me. Gargoyle's Quest would also get a sequel of its own, and while many may be familiar with the NES version, which first released in 1992, it also received a Game Boy port in Japan in the following year, titled Makaimura Gaiden: The Demon Darkness. Plot-wise, this one is technically a prequel, but with a very similar setting and gameplay format, with a hybrid of top-down RPG-like exploration and NPC interactions, interspersed with action platforming and a near-identical moveset. It does, however, feature a new ability that expands your movement considerably in the tornadoes that help with traveling upwards without the need to cling to walls. The Game Boy port also has 2 exclusive areas and some abilities not seen in the NES version, a nice bit of extra content to trade off for having to play on a more cramped screen. If you haven't played either version, I would have to say the NES is the way to go, but this is still a fun and very solid port to check out if you want to see the extra stuff. I should also mention the OG Ghosts and Goblins also had an appearance on the Game Boy Color, and is one of those carts that still works on an original Game Boy as well. But I'll dig into that one more deeply in another video focused on Game Boy Color horror releases. And we've got another staple of gothic horror action platforming here, with a handful of handheld Castlevania titles. The first being Castlevania The Adventure, released in 1989 and developed and published by Konami. Despite the adventurous title, this one sticks closer to the straightforward structure of the original NES game, as opposed to the open-world nature of Simon's Quest, and it features a somewhat lean experience of just 4 levels in total. The game doesn't necessarily feel too short, however, thanks in part to being a pretty robust challenge. but maybe mostly for its extremely slow character movement. You control Christopher Belmont here, with the story taking place about 100 years before Castlevania 1, jumping and whipping your way to a final battle against Dracula. Aside from the agonizingly slow pace, which was likely an effort to counteract the horrible screen blur of the original Game Boy, fans of the original Castlevania might still feel right at home here. It does make a few weird changes though, such as the lack of sub-weapons altogether, and the fact that taking damage downgrades your whip, so the game just gets exponentially harder if you're already struggling not to get hit. I feel like for its time, very early in the Game Boy's life cycle, this was a solid start for Castlevanias on handhelds, but in hindsight it doesn't stack up too well against what was to follow. It's worth mentioning this also got released in a Konami Game Boy collection, the European version featuring some basic color support for Game Boy Color, and it also got a wonderful remake on the Nintendo Wii with Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth, a complete reimagining and overhaul, but does have some fun references to the original. Two years later, 1991 would see the release of Belmont's Revenge, a direct sequel to Castlevania The Adventure. Taking place 15 years after the events of the first game, and Christopher Belmont must rescue his son from Dracula's freshly rebuilt castle. This one is much improved from the first game in several aspects, not only with much better graphics and sound, but with a more natural feeling character speed, and return of familiar Castlevania mechanics like the sub-weapon system, and no more punishing whip downgrades if you get hit. It does certainly feel a bit easier overall thanks to this, but I'd say it's much less tedious in exchange, and it's just overall much more fun to play through. The levels feel a lot more interesting as well. You have 4 different stages to pick from, which can be completed in any order, each with their own setting, and then ultimately a romp through Dracula's castle, which ramps up the challenge nicely. So it's still a bit short, but honestly a great length for a handheld action game. And the soundtrack is simply incredible, with some of the best music on the handheld period. And like the first game, this also got a mildly colorized version on a later Konami Game Boy collection if you're curious. Either way, it's well worth a playthrough, and I'd consider it one of the best action games on the system. Six years later, Konami would drop one more Castlevania title on the original Game Boy with the release of Castlevania Legends, just a few months after the release of Symphony of the Night, to give you an idea of how late this was in the Game Boy's life cycle. With development handled by KCE Nagoya instead of the previous team, some interesting liberties were taken with the storyline on this one, featuring Sonia Belmont in an origin story of the Belmont clan that would ultimately be removed from the series canon due to some considerable conflicts in the overall series timeline. She is kind of a cool character though, gradually learning various spell abilities as you make progress instead of the typical sub-weapon system. And the game does encourage some minor exploration of finding items needed to get the true ending. Funnily enough, they are basically the classic sub-weapons, which you can't actually use. And the game teeters between the straightforward action of the other previous Game Boy titles while making small efforts to include some Symphony of the Night vibes. But it really doesn't dip too far into being as expansive or deep, and unfortunately is still a step down in quality from something like Belmont's Revenge. But it's a pretty solid game anyway, it just suffers from having the high expectations brought along with the Castlevania brand. And there's one more Castlevania game on the system here, with the spin-off Kid Dracula, released in 1993, and following up on the Famicom game Akumajo's special Boku Dracula-kun, which was released in 1990. Now, this is kind of a sequel remake hybrid thing here, reusing familiar mechanics and level designs, but also remixing them and introducing new stuff as well. You play as the son of Dracula in a much more light-hearted spoof on the Castlevania formula, facing off with Galamoth, and with a cartoony version of Death helping you out as well. Actual gameplay may feel more reminiscent of something like Mega Man, with an emphasis on firing projectiles and utilizing special attacks and abilities learned as you progress through the game's linear stages, such as homing shots, turning into a bat, or even busting out Umbrella Lugosi. There are silly mini-games in between levels you can take part in as well, if you have the coins. And as goofy as the vibes are here, it's still a really great game with a bit of bite to it, and has enough new surprises to keep you on your toes if you played through the Famicom game already. This one often gets mistaken for a direct port, but I might go so far to say it's even better, despite being shrunk down to a smaller screen, and I might go so far to say that it's the best Castlevania game on the system. Speaking of Dracula, we've got one more title here surrounding the legendary vampire with Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of many games in the massive merchandising push surrounding the release of Francis Ford Coppola's film in 1992. Across the 8 different gaming platforms that got a game, the NES, Master System, Game Gear, and Game Boy games are fairly similar to each other, with a platformer having you control Jonathan Harker escaping from Dracula and eventually destroying him. It's a pretty fast-paced and rather challenging game, with quick movement and a steady supply of enemies and hazards to deal with, but at least there are question mark blocks full of items everywhere, just like in the movie. This version actually feels even more difficult in handheld form, with a much more restricted view, not to mention frequent lagging frame rates and eaten inputs as compared to the NES version. It does at least still have some solid graphics and retains that dark and weird soundtrack from Jur and Tell, but I'm not sure I'd mess with this one unless you really enjoyed the better home version. Enough Dracula, let's get into some Jankenstein gaming with Dr. Franken, released in 1992 and developed by Elite Systems out of Great Britain. You play Frankenstein's monster, Franky, in a search action game where you must explore a 7-floor mansion and track down all the body parts of your girlfriend, Bitsy. You're often walled off by locked doors or other Metroidvania-like gated areas that need specific items or abilities to keep making progress through a surprisingly expansive facility. Of course, there are scores of enemies and other traps hiding around, and with everything made that much more dangerous and annoying thanks to some very slippery feeling controls. Franky is quite well animated though, and with that often comes input lag and janky hit detection. The lack of invincibility frames doesn't help matters either. You can at least blast enemies with lightning bolts, and sometimes you might find a helpful little charging station. If you're curious, there were also prototypes of this for the Game Gear and NES that were eventually cancelled, but it did get an SNES game called The Adventures of Dr. Franken, although that has considerable changes and way more 90s attitude. But some of that tood would be seen in the sequel as well. Yes, that's right, there's a Dr. Franken II, again from Elite Systems and with similar gameplay, but he's got shorts and a t-shirt this time. The sequel at least gets you out of the house a bit more, with a hub-like area outside heading to other varieties of environments like forests, the sea, or even Egypt, and there are often NPCs requesting you to do something or bring them something in order to keep going. Somehow the controls feel even worse on this one, so don't expect any improvements in that department. And it's still quite easy to get bewilderingly lost and frustrated with the platforming. And this next one isn't a horror game at all, really, unless you are as deathly afraid of slide puzzles as I am. But I bring it up briefly since our boy Franky is part of the fun, in Franky, Joe, and Dirk on the Tiles, which is also randomly starring Joe from Joe and Mac, and Dirk the Daring from Dragon's Lair. Honestly, there's not much to see here, unless you really enjoy this type of puzzle game. Speaking of Dirk, I should also mention Elite Systems made a Dragon's Lair game for the Game Boy. Not quite horror either, but it fits snugly into an adjacent dark fantasy territory at times. Rather than trying to do the quick time events like the arcade game, instead this takes the form of a brutal precision platformer, with a similar trial and error ethos. This might be a fun one for the masochists out there. And just to quickly bring up a couple more adjacent dark fantasy things, you could make an argument for this one being a bit on the spooky side with Wizards and Warriors Fortress of Fear, which feels a bit more in the vein of a Castlevania game as compared to the original NES trilogy. Maybe it's the bats and skulls and dungeon-like environments, or maybe it's the punishing difficulty that you could often expect from a rare developed game of that era. And without getting too far off track here, I also wanted to mention a nice little deep cut with Cave Noire, a Japanese exclusive Konami title from 1991. Again, it's admittedly not much of a horror title, but a very cool little dungeon crawling roguelike game, with a wonderful balance of simplicity and actually intense decision making the deeper you go. It's honestly deserving of a deeper dive on this channel at some point, so maybe keep that on your radar. And we're gonna get supernatural with the next block of games here. First with Avenging Spirit, published by Jalico, and a port of their 1991 arcade game also known as Phantasm, and brought to the Game Boy in 1992. It starts with a somewhat dark premise, with you on a walk with your girlfriend before getting shot to death by gangsters, who then kidnap her. Her paranormal researcher father has summoned your spirit to rescue her, and the main gameplay gimmick has you inhabiting the bodies of any of the variety of enemies within the game, all with their own movement traits and attack maneuvers. This body-possessing mechanic makes for some really interesting approaches to otherwise typical action platforming, and it supplies you with plenty of choice and strategy for dealing with different hazards, or simply just to accommodate your own playstyle. I cringe a little bit to call this a hidden gem, but it's hard not to deny that it is one, considering the obscurity of its original release, and it's super fun, really worth a look. Recently it did get some more attention with an officially licensed physical cart re-release, along with the arcade original getting ports to modern consoles. And we've got another obscure treasure here with Hammerin Harry, Ghost Building Company, a sequel to Irem's deep-cut classic released for arcades and the Famicom, with this Game Boy follow-up getting released in Japan and Europe in 1992. Harry and his hammer are back, obviously, this time dealing with copious amounts of ghosts and other creeps that have kidnapped his girlfriend. You'll smash your way through 5 stages, including haunted construction sites, haunted houses, haunted sewers, and eventually the supernatural source, the ghost building machine. Now, I hadn't heard of this one until making this video, and it's actually really fun and charming. It's got great cartoony graphics and nice chunky sprites to make for good visibility on the little screen. It's got hot jams for days, and it has a nice edge of difficulty to it as well. It reminds me a bit of Monster Party on the NES, not just in a hammer baseball bat based combat, but also in that it never takes itself too seriously. It is just a fun and silly, spooky romp. Next up is Bubble Ghost, a French game originally made for the Atari ST in 1987, but would go on to get ports to several computer platforms and eventually this Game Boy port in 1990. The concept is simple but quite satisfying, having you control an adorable little ghost in a haunted house who apparently loves playing with bubbles, and you must guide a bubble through various rooms of the house by blowing it around various obstacles and keeping it from popping. Sometimes you may need to interact with objects or various creatures in your path as well to figure out the safest way to the exit. It's surprisingly addictive and engaging, a true testament to providing fun gameplay without many complications. The Game Boy port has some great cute graphics and a wonderful theme song, notably an early work from Hitoshi Sakamoto, who would go on to score Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy Tactics. This is certainly not a scary game at all, but some of the difficult rooms get legit intense. And generally, it's just plain fun and a great pick-up and play title for the handheld. And the ghost with the most makes a Game Boy appearance with Beetlejuice, horrific hijinks from the Netherworld, released in 1992 and developed by Rare. Rather than porting the game they also made for the NES, based on the hit Tim Burton movie, the Game Boy version would be an all-new experience, and also using the cartoon series as its main source material. You play as Beetlejuice, cleaning out the ghosts in Lydia's house, and eventually rescuing her from the evil Astaroth, with gameplay mostly consisting of action platforming, but with plentiful mini-games or even vehicular sections scattered about. When you're not shooting down enemies, you might be piecing together plumbing, getting into scary face competitions, playing classic concentration, or once again, my bane of existence rears its ugly head again, slide puzzles. Now, the second half of the game steps up the Battletoads-esque difficulty with some deadly platforming, minecart rides, and bouncing a pogo snake through a deadly spike-filled course. Much like the NES game, this one can be a bit bewildering and maybe even off-putting at first, but ultimately I found it to be a really fun time and a satisfying challenge if you can stick with it. And if you're curious, I also made a video on every Beetlejuice game if you're craving more games starring our favorite scumbag bio-exorcist. The Ghostbusters would get a couple of haunted handheld titles, cashing in on the success of the light-hearted horror comedy blockbuster flicks, with Ghostbusters II being loosely based on the sequel. Not to be confused with the North American NES title developed by Imagineering, this Game Boy game was instead developed by HAL Laboratory. It would also be paired with a Japanese and European expanded counterpart for the Famicom and NES, called Real Ghostbusters II. While that game never came out stateside due to licensing issues, at least we got this one, a top-down action game having you pick a pair of Ghostbusters, and you control one with the proton pack while the other one follows you around with a ghost track. I will admit this works quite a bit better in the NES version, as here your buddy really frequently gets stuck in other rooms or behind furniture or something, so it's a constant battle of babysitting while dealing with capturing the numerous enemies scattered around each area. It's simple, straightforward fun, and while I gotta recommend the NES version over this one, the two titles have enough differences in their levels to make this one worth playing as well. To further confuse matters with the titles of these Ghostbusters games, the Game Boy also got a game for The Real Ghostbusters, tying in with the Ghostbusters cartoon of the time. This is hardly a real Ghostbusters game, however, as this is actually part of Kemco's Crazy Castle series of puzzle platforming games, notorious for hot-swapping in licensed properties and mascots across regions. In this case, the Japanese version has Mickey Mouse, Europe got Garfield, and this Ghostbusters one is the North American release. As you can guess, it's kinda shoehorned in. You can actually just use your proton pack to laser at the floor, Lode Runner style, and the levels don't really even have any spooky themes. I don't think I even saw any ghosts in the first few stages. Aside from that, it's still kinda fun anyway, if you like this type of game. Just don't expect much actual Ghostbusters content in there. We've got some more kid-friendly ghost action here with Casper, released in 1996 by Natsume, and one of many games tying into the 1995 film. The Game Boy title is a very cheap-feeling minigame collection, with each stage requiring completing 4 different minigames, some of them repeating themselves, and all of them pretty jank and derivative. We've got a Lode Runner-like, a Missile Command-like, an Arkanoid-like, and an Incredible Machine-like. I couldn't make sense of this minigame, honestly. I don't have a lot of positive things to say about this one, I'm afraid. Very afraid. And real quick, I want to mention a couple of Japanese-only titles based on popular licenses over there. First with GeGeGe no Kitaro, Yokai Sozoshu Arawaru, one of many games based on Shigeru Mizuki's manga series full of supernatural yokai goodness. This Game Boy game is unfortunately untranslated at the moment, and it's a rather text-heavy RPG looking extremely reminiscent of the first Pokemon game. I'm keeping my eye out for a fan translation on this someday. Maybe this is a fun one, but the language barrier is keeping me away for now. The Go Ackman series would also get a Game Boy game based on Akira Toriyama's comedy manga about a mischievous demon kid. This one is certainly playable without knowing Japanese, as it's a top-down arcade maze game similar to Pac-Man. Other than the demon kid thing, it's a big reach to call this horror, but I just wanted to call it out anyway, and it's a simple but fun one to pick up and play quickly. Now, I grew up watching both of the Gremlins movies over and over again, which maybe explains a lot. But besides enabling my unusual obsession with gross little mischievous monster flicks, Gremlins also spawned quite a few video games of varying quality, with a considerable amount surrounding the release of Gremlins 2, the new batch, across 9 different computer and console platforms. Sunsoft was behind the NES and Game Boy titles, and while the NES game is by far the best of the bunch, they did a solid job on the handheld take as well, opting for a side-scrolling platformer approach instead of top-down action. And the gameplay is surprisingly difficult here, with a lot of precision and quick reflexes required in navigating some precarious stages, compounded by Gizmo usually being armed with a frustratingly tiny pencil to fend off the gremlins with. But in typical Sunsoft fashion, the graphics and music are great, and the game's toughness makes up for the somewhat short length of the game. And I also made a video on all the Gremlins games, if you want to dive a bit deeper onto that series. "1991 saw a resurgence in everyone's creepy and kooky sitcom family with the hit film The Addams Family, based on the old cartoon and TV series. Naturally, for the time, any hit movie would be ripe for pumping out video games, and the Game Boy would see 2 different titles released in 1992 and 1993. First up, this one, simply titled The Addams Family, would bear some mild resemblance to the other initial Addams Family games, but would stand on its own in general. Honestly, this is a bit of a rough one, removing the fun hop and bop gameplay from the 16-bit games, and instead has you controlling a sluggish Gomez with a limited number of throwing knives, wandering around the mansion and its grounds trying to rescue family members. I've tried quite a few different Addams Family games in my day, and this feels like one of the more rushed and unpolished attempts. And I'm afraid it doesn't get much better in Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt. Originally, this was an NES title, which was basically a weird port of the Amiga, Super Nintendo, and Genesis Addams Family game, but they swapped out Gomez for Pugsley, and also swapped out in-game music for silence. I guess that makes it more ominous or something. And the Game Boy version is a port of that NES port, so it's ports all the way down here. and this slimmed down version generally makes the gameplay faults here even worse. This one is for real jank sickos only, but if you have to play a Pugsley scavenger hunt game, maybe check out the Super Nintendo version, which is brutal to play through, but at least has its own unique levels and stuff going on. And let's keep the licensed property game train rolling here with a few more not quite horror but adjacent things, including a Game Boy game for Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, based on the cartoon series, which is based on the 70s schlock cult classic movie about, you guessed it, killer tomatoes. Certainly more spoofy than spooky, this weirdly got a handful of video games over the years. The Game Boy game was developed by Equilibrium and published by THQ in 1992. And it's quite different from the Imagineering developed title on the NES from around that same time. It's still a platformer, but with some questionable controls as you jump around kicking tomatoes and trash cans and whatnot, looking for various items required to leave the stage, all while frequently experiencing jarring amounts of lag. This one feels difficult for the wrong reasons, but something about this particular license gives off a fun and goofy vibe, so you might still find yourself having a good time with this one while struggling with its technical issues. And another somewhat horror-adjacent game here came from the same dev-publisher combo with Swamp Thing on the Game Boy, based more on the cartoon series than the comics, I'd say, and seeming to utilize a similar game engine to Killer Tomatoes, but somehow even more busted. The lag is really rough here, and you also have these boomerang-like attacks that drain your health. There are tons of random things hitting you that are really hard to avoid, and this one is painful to play, honestly. That's even coming from a big fan of the NES Swamp Thing game. So naturally, I will probably try to beat this someday anyway. Recommended for intrepid explorers of jank only. Troma Team's Toxic Crusaders toy line and cartoon series would also get a few video games in the early 90s, including this handheld one from Bandai. You might think that anything originating from the Z-grade Toxic Avenger films would be utter trash, but weirdly the Toxic Crusaders stuff is better than you might expect it to be, and the Game Boy game is no exception. It's a pretty fun little side-scrolling excursion through Tromaville, letting you pick between 5 different members of the squad: Toxie, Nose Zone, Headbanger, Major Disaster, and Junkyard, each with their own weapon and theme music, although honestly they all play quite similarly to each other. It's a bit annoying that their health doesn't refill between stages, but the continues will help ease your way to the ultimate showdown with Dr. Killamoth. Sam Raimi's pulp horror superhero movie from 1990 got a smattering of video games, mostly coming from Ocean Software in the following years, including a Game Boy game you're seeing here. While you might be more familiar with the notoriously difficult NES platformer, this one is a pretty tedious beat-em-up. It has similar directional attack controls to Double Dragon 2, which take a little bit of getting used to, and some pretty solid graphics and big sprites for Darkman and his foes. But you can't really fit too many enemies on screen at once here. Difficulty spikes up considerably during the boss fights if you have the patience to slog through the damage sponge punks on the way to them. It's pretty simple and kinda bad, but maybe it's worth a try if you love the movie enough. Now let's launch into deep space and get into some sci-fi horror territory. First with one of the many video games based on the movie Alien 3, which had a ton of different game adaptations for several consoles, computers, and handhelds, with the 1993 Game Boy version standing entirely apart from the other side-scrolling action games, and instead taking a top-down perspective. You control Ripley and have to explore the prison facility looking for a means of escape from an onslaught of face-huggers and xenomorphs. with gameplay leaning more into search action and puzzle solving than running and gunning. So in that regard, this may be one of the more movie-accurate iterations of the bunch, and perhaps one of the closest examples to a survival horror experience in our entire list today. I'm afraid to say that doesn't necessarily make it a good game. It's a bit obtuse and cryptic at times, but at least its uniqueness may warrant some further exploration. An Alien vs. Predator game would also see a Game Boy release in 1993, in a more straightforward action platformer where you control a predator hunting down xenomorphs through 7 stages on a planet overrun by aliens that wiped out his fellow predators when they underestimated their sheer numbers. It has a mix of melee combat and projectile weapons depending on what items you can find, and each stage has a bit of exploration involved to find keys or bombs to open up new pathways. It's got some nice chunky sprites and solid graphics, and a nice little auto map in the HUD, and at the very least it's not a straight port of the disappointing SNES beat-em-up title. And of course, we can't forget Metroid II, released in 1991, and follow-up to the groundbreaking NES action-adventure classic from 5 years prior. While the series doesn't typically lean too heavily into pure horror vibes, the feelings of isolation and tension while exploring these dark and mysterious planetscapes are strong, and perhaps even amplified on the monochromatic Game Boy in various ways. You play as Samus, sometime following the events of the first game, and on a mission to explore the Metroid's home planet SR-388 to completely annihilate the rest of the species one by one. The dark atmosphere and moody bleeps and boops of the soundtrack really make for a genuinely creepy experience while hunting down all of these things, which have also mutated in various ways to keep things fresh. And of course, in classic Metroid fashion, you'll need to deeply explore and examine your environment to find new weapons, movement abilities, and additional health and missiles needed for survival. While this one may have some shortcomings on the hardware that can't be ignored, like a cramped screen viewport, and the lack of color that makes exploring a bit tougher than it needs to be, it's still definitely a worthwhile experience and certainly one of the best action-adventure titles on the system. Its legacy would continue with a fresh remake on the 3DS in 2017, and it's also worth mentioning an excellent fan-made project, AM2R, from 2016, which unfortunately was pulled offline due to cease and desist orders from Nintendo. Yeah, this one is a real stretch, honestly, but I'll quickly mention Altered Space, an isometric puzzle platformer in the vein of Solstice, notably with programming by Mike Fallen and music by his brother Jeff. You control an astronaut trapped on an alien spaceship, trying to escape to your own vessel and return to Earth. Don't expect heavy, dark horror vibes or anything, it's mostly very cartoony and cute looking, but the fact that you are constantly fighting to have enough oxygen to survive is mildly terrifying, on top of the game being diabolically difficult. And while we're on the sci-fi tip here, we gotta list off a few sci-fi action horror adjacent games that don't quite fit into horror but certainly have their fair share of monstrous alien fiends and HR Giger guts. Konami's Contra franchise had 2 Game Boy installments, Operation C and Contra the Alien Wars, a solid port of Contra 3. The brutal shmup series R-Type also had its first 2 titles ported to the Game Boy, and even got a DX version on Game Boy Color. The freaky cyberpunk flick Lawnmower Man also had a Game Boy game tie-in. It's a run and gun similar to the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, and even makes attempts to include the weird VR-like moments. And the slasher movie adjacent Terminator would also see a few Game Boy game appearances with T2 Judgment Day, T2 the arcade game, and RoboCop vs. Terminator. And finally, this is a pretty big reach here, but we might as well throw a Turok game into the mix too, with Battle of the Bionosaurs. And after all, I did mention that series in my N64 horror game video. And I also like to give some quick mentions to giant monster kaiju games in these lists. There's a few of these big boys crammed into the Game Boy experience. Godzilla got 2 different titles, with a very cute puzzle platformer developed by Compile, and a less cute Japanese exclusive title from Bandai, Kaiju-O Gojira. Gamera also got a cinematic turn-based fighting game, and Ultraman got 5 different games. And one more little blast of adjacency I want to mention are the Last Bible games on the Game Boy, which are handheld spin-offs of the Megami Tensei RPG series. These are definitely lacking some of the darker themes usually seen in Mega 10 games, and they seem to be made more kid-friendly and simplified experiences, with demons mostly replaced by less threatening monsters, and set in a medieval fantasy setting instead of a post-apocalypse. So don't expect much spooky stuff here. The fans of the series or anyone looking for some solid handheld RPGs might be interested in the 2 installments Last Bible 1 and 2, along with Another Bible, which is a turn-based strategy RPG. And notably, Last Bible 1 would be the only spin-off here to get an official English localization, retitled to Revelations: The Demon Slayer, later released for Game Boy Color. And that wraps up our list of handheld horror today, but you can imagine it doesn't totally end here. In some future videos, I'd like to get into a nice assortment of spookiness on the Game Boy Color, and of course we should eventually explore the recent renaissance of homebrew Game Boy game development, which unleashed plenty of terror-filled experiences on the system. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.